Hello, and welcome to Badger Talks Live Quick Picks, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Sydney Kraszewski from Wausau, Wisconsin, Marathon County. I'm a sophomore and I'm majoring in international studies with plans to double major in Russian. I'm pleased to introduce Professor Mikhail Troitskiy. Today, Mikhail will discuss the existing approaches to ending the armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine and analyze its consequences for Ukraine, Russia, the United States, and the world. Mikhail Troitskiy is professor of practice at the UW-Madison Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia, and Department of Political Science. His research focuses on conflicts, security, and politics in Eurasia, Russian foreign policy, and U.S.-Russia relations, arms control, and international negotiation. Mikhail was Deputy Director and Program Officer at the Russia Office of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation in 2009 until 2015. In 2014 to 2022, he taught at the European University in St. Petersburg, and in 2003 to 2002 at MGIMO University in Moscow, where he also was Dean of the School of Government and International Affairs from 2017 until 2022. Mikhail has 10 years of experience in political risk and NGO management consulting. Please welcome Mikhail Troitskiy.
Thank you very much, Sydney, and welcome everyone to this Badger Talk video on Russia's war in Ukraine. So in my talk, we will discuss some background and the consequences of the war for major stakeholders, and we'll wrap up by talking about some scenarios going forward. So let's start with some reflection on the background of the war. So before 1991, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union and inherited close economic, political, and security ties with Russia. About a decade ago, Ukraine started getting closer to the European Union. Ukraine's prospect of joining NATO started to be discussed. Now, in their turn, Russian President Putin and his government wanted to keep Ukraine within their orbit, viewing the Ukrainian drift towards the West as a matter of national security. And the Kremlin was looking to build an integration bloc with some post-Soviet republics, and it considered Ukraine as a key member of any such bloc. So when a pro-Russian government was overthrown in Ukraine in February 2014, Putin moved to quote-unquote punish Ukraine by annexing the Crimean Peninsula and invading parts of eastern Ukraine under the pretext of self-determination for ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Over the following years, Putin would be carried away by the idea that not just eastern Ukraine, but the whole of Ukraine was part of the Russian nation. And so it had to be liberated from the embrace of other countries that, according to Putin and his associates, wanted to make Ukraine an enemy of Russia. Now, in its turn, after the annexation of Crimea, Ukraine developed stronger ties with the European Union and NATO on matters of trade, migration, and security. Interactions with Russia were scaled down. Eventually, Russia decided to raise the stakes and massed armed forces on the Russian border with Ukraine. And on February 24th, 2022, Putin ordered a massive invasion of Ukraine, apparently counting on a quick, victorious operation, also known as a blitzkrieg. There was no proven immediate or even distant threat to Russia from Ukraine. So the invasion was indeed an act of unprovoked aggression. The invading force was likely the size of 200,000 men. And despite a series of setbacks during the war and unfulfilled plans of quickly taking the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, Russia moved to occupy and annex 4 Ukrainian regions. This is what currently the situation on the ground looks like. You can pause the video here and take a closer look at the map. but we will move on to the consequences of the war so far. And so far, the toll of this horrific war has been immense. Now, casualties, precise information on the casualties is withheld by both sides. A very conservative estimate would put the number of deaths, both civilian and military, on both sides at 100,000 to 150,000. But from my perspective, a more realistic assessment of the number of victims in the Russian-Ukrainian war so far stands between 300 and 400,000, which makes it the deadliest conflict in Europe since 1945. Entire Ukrainian cities were leveled, so the number of confirmed civilian casualties is very likely to grow as forensic experts get access to those sites. And to me, the most horrifying scenes were those of apartment houses being struck by missiles all around Ukraine, with dozens of victims in each case. And in big Russian cities, millions of people live in similar concrete apartment buildings. So the Russians should have no problem imagining what it can be like if their house is hit by a missile or a drone, and they should be horrified. Now, filtration camps for Ukrainians on seized territories have been in operation, and the International Criminal Court has issued a warrant for Putin and his children's rights ombudswoman for forcefully moving children from Ukraine into Russia. Now, Russia demands that Ukrainians on the occupied territories adopt Russian citizenship or force deportation. Now, refugees. The United Nations estimates that about 14 million people have been displaced in Ukraine out of the population of about 44 million as a result of the Russian attack. And of those displaced, about 8 million fled to other European countries. Now, infrastructure. So in October 2022, Russia launched a campaign of missile strikes against civilian targets in Ukraine, primarily electric power supply infrastructure. And that led to blackouts all around Ukraine. In many cases, civilians were killed, and Russia seemed to deliberately strike targets in residential and business areas that had nothing to do with the electrical grid of Ukraine. So destruction in Ukraine has been assessed by Ukrainian researchers at around 150 billion US dollars, which they believe is equal to the cost of building up the city of Los Angeles from scratch. These researchers also claim that 1 out of every 13 residential buildings in Ukraine has been damaged since the start of the war. Now, Russian emigration and the Russian image. Overall, about 2 million people have left Russia since the start of the war because of disagreement with the Russian actions in Ukraine, and also to escape from just being rounded up and sent to the battlefront. Some of those people may have eventually returned to Russia, but not too many. A similar number of people actually left Russia in the wake of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. And of course, in the current situation, Russia's global image and standing and reputation took a strong hit because of the invasion. Gallup Media reported about a week ago that now is the first time in the history of their global polling that more than 50% of the population in the 137 countries that Gallup polls actually disapproved of Russia's policies. Now, the costs. So what has been the cost of the war for the main stakeholders? The United States allocated about 115 billion as emergency funding to support Ukraine, and in connection with the war in Ukraine so far. It was about 2% of the total federal budget expenditure in 2022. Likely around 2/3 of that funding was given directly to Ukraine in different forms, mostly as supplies of weapons. Now, European Union institutions have so far made available more than 40 billion euros to Ukraine, and that's not counting individual member contributions and donations to Ukraine. That is quite difficult to get reliable information on. Now, Russia's war in Ukraine made a significant contribution to inflation globally because of the rising prices of energy and food. And in the European Union, inflation, the rate of inflation in 2022 was 2.2%, and it tripled in comparison to 2021. The impact of Russia's war in Ukraine on the United States economy beyond the expenditure to support Ukraine is difficult to quantify. It is likely small, although a political debate has been ongoing in the United States for some time now as to how much money the United States should continue to give Ukraine. Now, we move on the global impact of the war. So the war has indeed had a profound global impact. In Europe, NATO expanded to include Finland, that you see up here on this map in blue. Sweden, marked in yellow, has also applied to join and has been approved for membership by all NATO countries except Hungary and Turkey, but those blocks are likely to be removed in the foreseeable future. And that was a direct consequence of Russia's assault on Ukraine. In some scenarios, Ukraine's membership in NATO may also be in the cards, because from the NATO perspective, Ukraine has been successfully holding back Russia for some 14 months now, and Russia is the successor state of the Soviet Union that NATO was established to deter almost 75 years ago. And it is also broadly acknowledged by experts worldwide that China may now be learning the lesson of a potentially vigorous response to a Chinese attempt to invade Taiwan, especially given that an amphibious operation to take over Taiwan would anyway be much more difficult to carry out for China than a land invasion of Ukraine was for Russia. Now we move on to some scenarios. Now, where is the war and more generally the conflict in Europe headed? There are two general perspectives on the possible outcomes and future trajectories for the participants and for the main stakeholders. So one perspective that you see on this slide now is based on the expectation that Ukraine is going to prevail over the Russian occupying forces and drive them out of Ukraine sooner rather than later. Such expectations are based on several assumptions. First, that Ukraine still has enough highly trained military personnel to defeat the Russian forces in key theaters. Then second, that Ukraine now has enough military equipment, especially advanced weapons supplied by NATO countries, including the United States. And finally, the final assumption is that the Russian positions in Ukraine are weak enough and that the morale of the Russian forces and their commanders is generally low. Now, the risks associated with this first scenario include potential escalation beyond Ukraine, with Russia trying to threaten NATO countries directly, including with the use of nuclear weapons. And another risk is that of an acute political crisis in Russia that could break out over failures of the Russian campaign in Ukraine, with Putin, for example, being marginalized and some hardline warmongers seizing power in Moscow. There's also the risk of failure of a Ukrainian counteroffensive operation, which may lead to Russia seizing the initiative and grabbing even more land in Ukraine. It may then spark a debate within NATO if the alliance should actually get more directly involved in the expanding conflict. And this is something that is direct involvement by NATO, is something that NATO has so far very much wanted to avoid. Now, the other perspective on where the war is headed is less optimistic with regards to Ukraine's chances to restore justice. So the skeptics claim that pushing back successfully against the Russians in Ukraine would require more power than is currently available to Ukraine in this war. And in addition, Russia has now dug in on the territories it seized from Ukraine over the last 14 months. And the Crimean Peninsula has indeed been heavily fortified and militarized, and supposedly it is now quite difficult to take over for Ukraine. And finally, the Ukrainian economy has been in quite a bad shape, and sustaining it requires massive infusions of cash on the part of the United States and the European Union, and perhaps other countries as well. And in some of those countries, governments may find themselves under pressure to rethink their unconditional pledges of support for Ukraine because of the high financial cost. It doesn't seem likely at this moment, but aid for Ukraine may become an issue, for example, in the next presidential campaign in the United States. So the risk of a scenario in which Russia keeps a solid chunk of Ukrainian territory include the possibility of further Russian incursions into Ukraine and potentially other countries in the future. And almost immediately, such a scenario would spark a very painful and divisive discussion in NATO countries where support for Ukraine has been strong enough. So that I guess even governments may fall over their failure to ensure what can be called as a victory for Ukraine. And finally, under the circumstances, the key question for many people is whether it can get deadlier and whether this conflict can proliferate beyond Ukraine. Some Russian officials have, as I just mentioned, issued threats of a nuclear strike against Ukraine or even NATO countries if they get directly involved in attacking what Russia considers to be its territory. And Putin himself has been deliberately vague about the conditions under which he would contemplate ordering a nuclear strike. Well, I think NATO countries are taking those risks into account as they support Ukraine in the war. Some of them would rather see negotiations between Moscow and Kiev begin right away. Many leaders in Europe and perhaps also here in the United States would rather avoid the risk of a massive escalation and or a severe political crisis in Russia, a major nuclear-armed country. But others, just like the Ukrainian leadership, believe that Russia will not have the resolve to escalate dramatically, and so Russia can be defeated gradually with or by conventional means. So to sum up, in the coming weeks or months, Ukraine will most likely try to push back against the Russian forces occupying Ukrainian territory. The outcome of that operation will largely depend on the number of servicemen that Ukraine is currently able to train and equip and field, and also on the quality of the weapons that Ukraine has been receiving from its Western supporters, primarily the United States. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for watching this Badger Talks live event produced by the University of Wisconsin-Madison through UW Connects Outreach and the Office of State Relations. Follow us on Facebook and YouTube to see the library of past recorded talks. Please visit badgertalks.wisc.edu to see the schedule of upcoming talks, sign up for the Badger Talks email list, and search the roster of over 400 UW experts who are available to give talks on important issues in your Wisconsin community.